if it's an American citizen, say over in somewhere in Pakistan, that is plotting and seeking to kill or destroy American citizens, it's okay for us to send a predator and fire and kill that person. But according to Senator from Illinois' interpretation, if that person were apprehended in Charleston planning to blow up Shaw Air Force Base, then that person would be given that individual's Miranda rights. Now, how in the world does that fit?
And to those American citizens thinking about helping al-Qaeda, please know what will come your way. Death, detention, prosecution. And when they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up.
Your time is expired.
Get a lawyer.
President Obama, on New Year's Eve, signed the National Defense Authorization Act. Gee, I wonder why he did it then. Obviously taking a lot of heat for it from progressives who he needs to help him win the election. He's just figured that out. And so he does it when no one is paying attention. And he does a signing statement along with it on H.R. 1540. So, first of all, a lot of people have been saying, hey, wait a minute now. It's not fair to say that this bill allows for the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens, because at one portion of the bill, it says this says shall not.
And I'm wondering whether the senator is familiar with the fact that the language which precluded the application of Section 1031 to American citizens was in the bill that we originally approved in the Armed Services Committee, and the administration asked us to remove the language which says that U.S. citizens and lawful residents would not be subject to this section. Is the senator familiar with the fact that it was the administration that asked us to remove the very language which we had in the bill which passed the committee, and that we removed it at the request of the administration, that would have said that this determination would not apply to U.S. citizens and lawful residents?
Mr. President, first of all, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. When you signed the National Defense Authorization Act into law, you issued a signing statement at that time that said you would not use that power for indefinite detention on Americans. You understood the concerns that people had. A judge earlier this year issued that the administration couldn't use those powers because it's unconstitutional. So why are the government's own lawyers fighting that judge's order, the injunction in particular?
Well, look, the basic principle here is, number one, my first job is to keep the American people safe. Number two, we've got to do it in a way that respects our values and our traditions of rule of law. That's why I ban torture. That's why I've argued that we should actually close Guantanamo. But I've also said that, we've got some bad guys who are down there who we may not be able to try in a traditional court, but have pledged to try to hurt Americans. And so that's something that we inherited, that we're dealing with, and it's complicated. On the other hand, what I also said was a U.S. citizen can never be subject to that kind of detention. Congress disagreed with me, and I didn't want us to not be able to finance our military and pay our soldiers and our troops. So I signed the bill, but what I also said was, look, that I'm never going to use this power, and what I would suspect is that the courts are going to agree with us over the long term that that is not something that you can use when it comes to U.S. citizens.
Well, let me ask you then also about the so-called presidential kill list that's gotten a lot of attention, and this list of folks who have been targeted for assassination. Right. And on that list have been U.S. citizens who have not been afforded trial, including Anwar al-Awlaki. How do you, as president, or any president for that matter, regardless of party or person, utilize that power to assassinate even U.S. citizens?
Well, first of all, you're basing this on reports in the news that have never been confirmed by me, and I don't talk about our national security decisions in that way. More broadly, though, our goal has been to focus on al-Qaeda, to focus narrowly on those who would pose an imminent threat to the United States of America, and that's why it's not just bin Laden, but a whole tier of al-Qaeda leadership has been taken off the field. And that's part of what has allowed us to now begin to transition out of Afghanistan, to begin to bring our troops home. We're going to have to be vigilant for the foreseeable future when it comes to terrorists, but we have to do so in a way that is consistent with the laws of war, with international law. That's something we've always abided by, but beyond that, I probably can't comment on something as specific as what you just mentioned.
But can you comment on, you mentioned about al-Qaeda during your speech, going after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, certainly going after them in Yemen as well. Yeah. And yet there's some concern about the U.S. funding the Syrian opposition when there are a lot of reports that al-Qaeda is kind of heading up that opposition. How do you justify the two?
Well, I share that concern, and so what we've done is to say we will provide non-lethal assistance to Syrian opposition leadership that are committed to a political transition, committed to an observance of human rights.
Over the past few weeks, we've shared with you my one-on-one interview with President Obama when he visited Ohio. Tonight, we're going to break down the fourth and final question of the interview. It was actually the first question we asked, and it might best represent the idea of a politician saying one thing and then doing another. This is a reality check you won't see anywhere else. Well, the issue at hand is one that we have talked about at length before. It's the National Defense Authorization Act, a bill that funds our military. But within that bill is one section, Section 1021. It gives the president the power to arrest and indefinitely hold even U.S. citizens who are simply accused of terrorism or aiding terror groups. A person who was a part of or substantially supported al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces that are engaged in hostilities against the United States or its coalition partners, including any person who has committed a belligerent act or has directly supported such hostilities in aid of such enemy forces, falls under Section 1021 of the NDAA. Now, to be clear, this law does not require that the government prove that you've been working with terrorists. It does not require that you're given a trial. It allows you to be held by the government indefinitely. And yes, it's called the Indefinite Detention Clause because it means that you can be held by the feds in prison without one shred of proof that you've done anything wrong until the end of our endless war on terror. Clearly a violation of the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution. President Obama, before this bill ever got to his desk, had said that he was against it, that he would veto it, but he didn't. The president signed the NDAA into law, but issued a signing statement which says in part, quote, "I want to clarify that my administration will not authorize the indefinite military detention without trial of American citizens. Indeed, I believe that doing so would break with our most important traditions and values as a nation." But the president's statement wasn't enough. Shortly after the NDAA was signed into law, a group of journalists and activists sued, saying the Indefinite Detention Clause violates the Constitution. In May, Judge Catherine Forrest issued an injunction saying that the Obama administration could not use that Indefinite Detention Clause until the constitutionality could be looked at. And yet, despite saying that he was against the clause in that signing statement, the Obama administration lawyers fought the injunction, saying that the president does in fact have the right to indefinite detention. Well, that is why when I got the chance to speak one-on-one with the president, I asked him why his lawyers were fighting this. When you signed the National Defense Authorization Act into law, you issued a signing statement at that time that said you would not use that power for indefinite detention on Americans. You understood the concerns that people had. Yeah. A judge earlier this year issued that the administration couldn't use those powers because it's unconstitutional. So why are the government's own lawyers fighting that judge's order, the injunction in particular?
Yeah. Well, look, the basic principle here is, number one, my first job is to keep the American people safe. Number two, we've got to do it in a way that respects our values and our traditions of rule of law. That's why I ban torture. That's why I've argued that we should actually close Guantanamo. But I've also said that, you know, we've got some bad guys who are down there who we may not be able to try in a traditional court, but have pledged to try to hurt Americans. And so that's something that we inherited, that we're dealing with, and it's complicated. On the other hand, what I also said was a U.S. citizen can never be subject to that kind of detention. Congress disagreed with me, and I didn't want us to not be able to finance our military and pay our soldiers and our troops. So I signed the bill, but what I also said was, look, that I'm never going to use this power, and you know, what I would suspect is that the courts are going to agree with us over the long term. Since my interview with the president, two things have happened. 2 weeks ago, Judge Forrest came back and made that temporary injunction a permanent one,
striking down the indefinite detention clause, calling it facially unconstitutional. Within just 24 hours, though, Obama administration lawyers filed an appeal. Last Monday, a lone appeals judge, Raymond Lawyer, from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, granted that stay, essentially honoring the administration's request and putting the indefinite detention provisions of the NDAA back into full effect. So what you need to know here is that talk is cheap. President Obama says he is against indefinite detention of U.S. citizens, and yet his administration, at every turn, has fought to keep those powers in place. The bottom line here, actions speak louder than words. And for anyone who has been following this case, it should be undoubtedly clear where the president actually stands on this issue. And that is Reality Check.